Imagine opening your front door to find a police officer standing there, not because you did anything wrong, but because something so unimaginable has happened nearby. They need to make sure you're safe. Now imagine that moment flipping your entire reality upside down, because what the officer tells you isn't about a stranger. It's about someone you know, someone you trust. That's how many of these shocking cases began. Quiet streets, normal families, an ordinary day. And then, in a split second, something so disturbing, so incomprehensible is discovered. It changes everything. This isn't fiction. This isn't a horror movie. This is real. These are the darkest, most twisted true crime stories police officers across the country still talk about with haunted eyes and shaken voices. And in the next few minutes, you're going to hear the truth behind the most shocking cases police have ever faced, ones that pushed even the most hardened detectives to their limits. You're here because you're curious, maybe a little disturbed. Maybe you just want to understand how something like this could actually happen. And you're not alone. We all have that part of our brain, the part that needs to know what went wrong, who's responsible, and more importantly, how it could have been prevented. That's what we're going to explore together. But I need you to do one thing. Stay with me till the end. Not just because this story demands to be heard in full, but because if you only hear the beginning, you'll walk away with the wrong impression. The most mind-blowing parts? The jaw-dropping twists? The answers to the questions racing through your head right now? They all come later.
So lean in.
Let's talk. Because the story I'm about to tell you might just be the one that changes how you look at the world around you. Let's start with Officer Rachel Dunn. 15 years on the force. Unshakable.
Calm.
She'd seen everything. Drug busts, murders, gang violence. But when she walked into that quiet suburban home in upstate New York, what she found sent her out of the house, dry heaving in the bushes. It wasn't the blood. It wasn't even the crime scene itself. It was what she saw on the living room wall. And no, I'm not talking about a message or graffiti. I'm talking about photographs, dozens of them. Candid shots of neighborhood children, families, pets. Photos taken without anyone's knowledge, from inside closets, attic vents, even through baby monitors. And in the center of that wall was a map, a chilling, color-coded road map of the entire neighborhood, with pins, names, and terrifying notes that no parent would ever want to read. That was just the beginning. Because what Officer Dunn didn't know at that moment was that the man who lived in that house was a retired school counselor, beloved in the community, and trusted by almost every parent on the block. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's horrifying, but surely the cops caught him right away, right? You'd think so. But what if I told you he vanished completely, right before they could question him? One second he's watering his lawn, the next he's gone, like he knew they were coming. That kicked off one of the most intense, multi-state manhunts in recent memory, and what they found in the weeks that followed only made the case more disturbing. Because this wasn't an isolated incident. It was connected to a string of disappearances that had never been solved, cases dismissed as runaways, accidents, or just bad luck. But when the dots finally connected, law enforcement realized they were dealing with someone who'd been operating under their noses for over 2 decades, and they never saw it coming.
Think about that.
2 decades. This man lived a double life in plain sight, hosting backyard barbecues, volunteering at local schools, coaching Little League, all while hiding a dark obsession that no one suspected. And it gets even worse. Because he wasn't working alone. And once detectives figured that out, the case exploded into something so big, so layered, and so horrifying that it pulled in police departments from 5 different states and forced the FBI to open a special task force just to manage the evidence. This wasn't just one man's secret. This was a network, and its roots went deeper than anyone dared to imagine. But that's just one story. And tonight, we're not talking about just one case. No, tonight, I'm taking you inside the most disturbing, mind-bending, emotionally gut-wrenching investigations that law enforcement officials have ever had to endure. These are cases that kept detectives up at night, drove seasoned officers to tears, and left entire communities shattered. We'll walk through the scene of a farmhouse in rural Ohio where an entire family disappeared without a trace, and the only clue left behind was a single voicemail that ended in a blood-curdling scream. We'll step into the cramped, dark basement of a man in Texas who claimed to be a collector of secrets, and whose journal entries revealed he believed he was on a mission from a higher power to cleanse humanity, starting with his neighbors. And we'll dive deep into a cold case from California, where police recently unearthed a time capsule buried under a school playground that held horrifying items linked to a series of unsolved child abductions from the 90s. Each case is stranger than the last. And with each story, I'm going to show you how the truth unraveled, how officers made one key mistake that nearly let a killer walk free, and how one lucky break, a note, a photograph, a child's innocent question, cracked it wide open. You'll meet the people behind the badges, the ones who refused to give up when others did, and you'll hear the gut-wrenching confessions from suspects who had everyone fooled for years. I'll show you how social media helped solve one case, how a TikTok video led detectives to an address they never would have found otherwise, and how a viral Reddit thread may have identified a serial killer before police even did. But before we go deeper, I want to ask you something. Are you ready for this? Because once we get into the details, you can't unknow them. These cases stick with you. They leave a mark. Not just because of the horror, but because of what they reveal about people. How much darkness someone can hide behind a smile, how fragile trust can be, and how close evil really is. You might never look at your neighbors the same way again. You might think twice the next time a friendly stranger offers to help. And you'll definitely question whether the people around you are really who they claim to be. So here we are, at the edge of something massive. And just as we're about to step into the first full case, a bombshell drops. New evidence. A twist that investigators never expected. A clue that had been sitting in plain sight for years, but no one noticed. Until now. And once they find it, everything changes. One of the most notorious suspects suddenly isn't who they thought. And the real monster? They're still out there watching, waiting, maybe even closer than anyone realizes. Stay with me. What comes next will chill you to the core. The man at the center of the storm, the one whose disappearance ignited a nationwide manhunt, was Gregory Harland, age 59, former guidance counselor at Ridgewood Middle School in upstate New York. On the surface, Gregory was the embodiment of small-town trust. The kind of man who wore the same beige cardigan every Monday, brought donuts to faculty meetings, and remembered every student's name years after they graduated. He was the last person anyone expected to be associated with anything criminal, let alone something grotesque. But as the layers began to peel away, investigators found themselves staring into a life far more complicated and far more chilling than anyone had ever suspected. People knew him as Mr. H. Friendly, soft-spoken, always patient. If you needed help, advice, or just someone to talk to, he was the guy. He lived alone, never married, had no children of his own, but everyone said he treated his students like family. It started with the photographs. At first glance, they seemed innocent enough: school events, birthday parties, holiday gatherings. But the deeper detectives looked, the more disturbing the pattern became. The photos weren't just candid. They were invasive. Some were taken through partially closed windows. Others were snapped from the back seats of cars or behind playground fences. And nearly every image was time-stamped and labeled in handwritten notes, the kind you'd expect in a case file, not a scrapbook. What made it worse was how meticulously they were organized. He had binders full of them, categorized by neighborhood, family, even the time of day. The evidence was damning, but what still didn't make sense, what haunted investigators, was the why. There was no evidence of physical harm, no confirmed victims at first. Just thousands of eerie photographs and pages upon pages of coded messages referencing something called the Quiet Harvest. That phrase would become central to the investigation and to understanding the depths of Gregory Harland's mind. People who knew Gregory personally were in complete disbelief. His colleague, Meredith Shaw, broke down during her interview, saying she refused to believe it even as the facts stared her in the face. Gregory was kind, she insisted. He gave money to students whose families were struggling. He stayed late after school helping kids with college applications. This has to be some kind of mistake. But the more detectives talked to people close to him, the more contradictions they uncovered. A few former students, speaking anonymously, admitted they'd always found something off about Mr. H, how he sometimes showed up at their after-school jobs uninvited, how he knew details about their lives they'd never shared. One even said she caught him watching her from his parked car late one night, but she brushed it off, thinking maybe she was imagining it. Nobody ever reported anything, because Gregory had built a shield of trust so thick, it made people question their instincts. Digging into his recent activities revealed even more inconsistencies. Surveillance footage showed him making weekly trips to a remote, wooded area about 30 miles from his home, always around the same time, always alone. He rented a storage unit under a false name near that area. One detectives later discovered held a disturbing collection of items: children's clothing, multiple cell phones, audio recording equipment, and a typewriter. It was in that storage unit they found a collection of typed pages, rambling, manifesto-style letters filled with strange, apocalyptic language. He spoke of cleansing, of silencing the noise, and repeatedly mentioned the quiet harvest as something that had already begun. But here's where things got murkier. Interspersed among the typed pages were references to people Gregory claimed were watchers and interceptors, people he believed were monitoring him, infiltrating his life, and trying to sabotage his work. Were these delusions? Paranoia? Or something more? The mention of watchers led police to consider a chilling possibility. What if Gregory wasn't acting alone? That's when other names began to surface. First, there was his childhood friend, Dennis Blackwell, a man with a minor criminal record, mostly petty theft and trespassing, who had once lived just a few blocks away from Gregory. Dennis had vanished years ago, believed to have moved across state lines. But recent credit card activity tied him to a motel near the same woods Gregory frequented. Then there was Marie Elkins, a woman in her early 50s who worked as a part-time librarian at the school and was often seen having long, hushed conversations with Gregory during her lunch breaks. She quit suddenly the week before his disappearance, and her cell phone was turned off the same day. When investigators tried to track her down, they found her apartment abandoned, rent unpaid, no forwarding address, and all her personal belongings gone except for a single locked drawer filled with religious texts and cryptic notes about purification rituals. Still, there were other possibilities. Some locals believed Gregory had been framed, set up by someone with a grudge. A former student, now in his late 20s, claimed Gregory had written a letter to the school board that derailed his teaching career. Could this be revenge? Others whispered about an underground network trafficking in surveillance content, selling photos and personal data harvested from hidden cameras. Maybe Gregory got involved, realized what he was part of, and tried to back out. Maybe that's why he disappeared. But nothing concrete ever surfaced to confirm any of it. Every lead opened another door, another question, and the deeper they went, the more reality began to blur into something darker, something that made even the most seasoned detectives lose sleep. What made it worse was the timing. Around the same period Gregory went missing, several counties reported a spike in child disappearances. At first, they didn't seem connected, different states, different circumstances. But one detail tied them together. Each child had been photographed near their school in the weeks before they vanished, and in 3 cases, the photos matched those found on Gregory's wall. That changed everything. Now, it wasn't just a case about a man with a twisted obsession. It was about a possible predator with victims stretching across state lines. But just as police prepared to go public with this discovery, something unexpected happened. A call came in from a retired truck driver in Tennessee who claimed he'd picked up a man fitting Gregory's description hitchhiking outside Nashville. The man, he said, was clean, calm, polite, and said his name was Jonas. He was carrying only a duffel bag and a small notebook. When asked where he was going, he said, "Home. The real one." The driver didn't think much of it until he saw Gregory's photo on the news a week later. By then, it was too late. The man had vanished again. So, who was Gregory Harlan really? A trusted counselor who snapped? A manipulative genius hiding behind a kind face? A pawn in something much larger and more sinister? Or was he something else entirely, something even the police didn't have a name for? And what about the others? Dennis, Marie, the children who disappeared, the coded references to watchers and harvests. What was the endgame? With every question, the tension grew. Each theory was more chilling than the last. And just when detectives thought they were starting to piece it together, another clue emerged, one that would blow the case wide open and force investigators to confront a terrifying possibility. The real orchestrator wasn't Gregory at all, but someone still lurking in the shadows. Watching. Waiting. And that's where everything starts to unravel. Just when the investigation seemed poised to break wide open, everything began to collapse, quietly, methodically, like someone was pulling strings behind the scenes. The digital evidence stored on Gregory Harlan's laptop, a machine that had been cataloged and sealed in police custody, mysteriously disappeared from the evidence room. The entire device was gone, no trace, no tampering on the logs, no footage from the surveillance cameras, which were conveniently down for maintenance during the exact time window it went missing. That laptop held not only thousands of photos, but encrypted folders detectives hadn't yet cracked, files they believed contained the names and coordinates tied to the quiet harvest. And just like that, the single most important piece of evidence vanished without a trace. What made it worse was that only a few people had access to the evidence room. One of them, Officer Daniel Hartley, had suddenly taken a leave of absence. No warning, no explanation. Calls to his home went unanswered. A welfare check revealed his apartment had been cleaned out almost surgically. No clothes, no electronics, nothing but a sink full of water and a photograph taped to the bathroom mirror, a black and white image of a child standing in a field at night, eyes scratched out with pen. Written underneath in thick, shaky handwriting were the words, "He warned you." The message shook the entire task force. And yet, the investigation pushed forward, cautiously, but not without resistance. Days after the photo appeared, lead detective Maria Eldridge received an anonymous envelope at her home. No return address. Inside were grainy photos of her two children at their school playground, images taken from a distance, but unmistakably recent. Along with the pictures was a note, typed in the same font style used in Gregory's abandoned manifesto, that read, "There is no truth, only silence." The threat was obvious. It was personal, and for the first time, Maria considered stepping back from the case, terrified that continuing would put her family in danger. But something deep inside her refused to stop. This case was more than a job now. It was something that crawled under your skin and refused to let go. She wasn't chasing a suspect anymore. She was chasing a ghost that had learned how to wear a human face. And that's when the past came back to haunt her. While combing through archived files for any mention of similar patterns, Maria stumbled across an old missing persons case, one that hit much closer than she expected. In 1996, a boy named Adam was reported missing in the same rural region Gregory had frequented. At the time, it was dismissed as a likely runaway. No evidence, no suspects. The boy was just 12 years old, lived in foster care, and had a documented history of behavioral issues. But Maria noticed something odd. The case report had been signed by a rookie social worker named Gregory Harlan. That connection had never been flagged before, mostly because the system used an older database that didn't sync with newer records. But here's where it got worse. The foster home Adam lived in was managed by a woman named Margaret Elkins, Marie Elkins' older sister. The same Marie who disappeared days before Gregory went missing. Suddenly, a web began to form, one reaching further back than anyone imagined. This wasn't a one-time incident or a recent spiral into darkness. It had roots, deep ones. Still, none of this proved Gregory was the mastermind. What if he was following someone else's design? What if he was only a piece of something much larger? A network, a cult, a system so quietly built over time that even law enforcement couldn't see it until it was too late. And then came the betrayal. Detective Eldridge's partner, Ray Donovan, who had stood by her side for months, unexpectedly filed for reassignment. No explanation, no face-to-face conversation. Just a 2-sentence email and a voicemail saying he didn't want to be part of this anymore. But Maria had a hunch. Something about his behavior had shifted lately. Less eye contact, shorter responses, a noticeable distance during their last few interactions. Driven by instinct, she requested a silent background check, and what came back chilled her. Ray's sister had gone missing in 2007 under similar circumstances. Never found. Never linked to any larger case. But guess who had been a guest speaker at her high school just weeks before her disappearance? Gregory Harland. It was becoming impossible to know who to trust. Leads were drying up. People were backing out. And every new discovery raised the stakes higher. But it was the most recent clue that delivered the biggest twist yet. A tip came from a woman in West Virginia who claimed she'd once been part of a cleansing retreat in the early 2000s. She remembered Gregory said he used the alias Jonas and ran workshops about silencing the inner scream. At first, she thought it was just fringe nonsense. But she remembered something chilling. He spoke often about the quiet harvest and said it wasn't a theory, it was a test. A test of obedience, of devotion. According to her, there were others, at least a dozen. They lived off-grid, communicated through symbols, and rotated locations every few years. She was willing to talk, to give details. But 2 days before her scheduled interview with investigators, her car was found crashed off the side of a mountain road. No skid marks. No cell signal. She didn't survive. And her cabin? Ransacked. Everything gone. Except for one thing left behind on the kitchen table, a cassette tape. No label. Just static for 30 minutes, until a voice comes through. Calm, measured. You've come far, but you're not ready for the end. And now the question isn't just about what happened to Gregory Harland. It's about who's still out there, watching, planning, waiting. Because if the evidence is being erased, if allies are turning into suspects, and if the very people meant to bring justice are being silenced, then how far does this conspiracy really go? And more importantly, who will be the next to vanish? Just when it felt like the case couldn't get any darker, it took a sharp turn no one saw coming. A former journalist named Claire Maddox, who had once written a scathing feature on Gregory Harland years ago, long before his name became synonymous with nightmares, suddenly reappeared with disturbing new information. Claire had dropped off the map after receiving a series of anonymous threats following the publication of her article. Everyone assumed she'd relocated or changed professions to escape the backlash. But the truth was far more chilling. Claire had been living under a different identity in Oregon, driven into hiding by the relentless stream of messages, stalkers, and visitors who claimed to know things about her past, things no one else should have known. Now, after hearing about Gregory's disappearance and the reemergence of the Quiet Harvest name, she decided to come forward. She didn't trust the media, didn't trust the police, and certainly didn't trust anyone still working within the system. But she trusted Maria Eldridge, or at least the version of her she saw on a true crime documentary a year earlier. So Claire reached out directly, sending a handwritten letter with no return address. The letter contained photos, names, timestamps, and one name circled over and over again in red ink, Elijah Roon. That name meant nothing to Maria at first, but Claire insisted Elijah wasn't just another suspect. He was the puppeteer, the one Gregory had always followed. His voice trembled as he recalled a memory he had kept buried for nearly 20 years. He said one night, while working alone in the lab, a man came to him.
Tall, polished,
Almost charismatic in a bone-chilling way. The man didn't threaten him. He just explained, calmly, that the truth was dangerous. That justice was subjective. That some people needed to be removed to preserve balance. Holloway never saw that man again. But after watching news reports on the Quiet Harvest, he couldn't stay silent any longer. When shown the image of Elijah Roon, he went pale. "That's him," he whispered. "That's the man." Suddenly, everything was in question. If evidence had been altered, if high-ranking officials were tied to Elijah, if even Maria's own captain had stood in that circle by the fire, then how far back did this go? How many cases were compromised? How many innocent people had vanished, forgotten, because someone decided they didn't belong? And perhaps the most terrifying question, who is next? But before Maria could share any of this with Claire, communication ceased. But if he was involved with Elijah, then how many decisions, how many dead ends? were not coincidences but calculated blocks. To make matters worse, a week after receiving Claire's letter, Maria received an unmarked package at her office. Inside was an old VHS tape, dusty but still intact. She had to borrow an old player from the evidence archive just to view it. What she saw made her physically sick. It was surveillance footage from what appeared to be a hospital room, timestamped 2004. In the footage, a young woman was strapped to a gurney, screaming, begging to be released. Standing in the corner, watching with a calm, unreadable expression, was Gregory Harland. But the camera pans just slightly at one point, revealing another man watching from the shadows. A tall figure, half obscured by the edge of the doorway. Maria took a screenshot and ran it through facial recognition software, and the result hit her like a freight train. The shadowy figure matched the profile of Elijah Roon. But there was one massive problem. Elijah Roon wasn't in any criminal databases. No driver's license. No tax records. No social media. Nothing that suggested he existed. It was as if he had been wiped from every official system, and yet his name and face kept showing up like echoes from another life. Claire insisted this was intentional. She claimed Elijah was a master of digital erasure, someone who had long figured out how to vanish in plain sight, while still pulling strings from behind the curtain. He didn't need to leave fingerprints because others did the work for him, blindly loyal, fanatically devoted. That same week, another bomb dropped. A retired forensic tech, James Holloway, came forward with an explosive claim. He confessed to falsifying evidence in one of Gregory Harland's earliest cases after being paid off. But he wouldn't say by among them, to Maria's horror, was someone she'd never suspected, her late mentor and former precinct captain, Thomas Greer. A man celebrated as a hero. A man who died under mysterious circumstances, allegedly from a heart attack, shortly after retiring in 2019. Everything Maria thought she knew about the case, about her own career, started to feel unstable, built on sand. She had trusted Greer. He had guided her through her toughest cases. Whom? Claire believed Elijah was the architect of something far larger than anyone imagined, a group that spanned states, possibly decades, with roots in academia, therapy circles, even criminal justice reform. She believed Gregory Harland was just a disciple, a frontman. But what truly blew the case wide open was a photo she enclosed. It showed Gregory and Elijah at a private retreat in 1998, smiling, holding hands with a circle of attendees around a bonfire. According to Claire, Elijah was a sociopathic manipulator who believed in ritualized obedience, a practice rooted in breaking people psychologically until they surrendered their will. Claire had spent over a year investigating this man after hearing whispers about his influence over fringe communities in the Pacific Northwest. But every lead went cold. The people she interviewed either recanted their stories or disappeared shortly after. The burner number Claire had used went dark. Her online alias deleted. Even her forwarding mail address in Oregon was shut down. It was as if someone had anticipated her move and cut the thread just as she tried to pull it. And when Maria returned home one night, exhausted and mentally spiraling, she found something waiting at her doorstep. A simple white envelope. Inside, a photo of her standing in her backyard, watering her garden, taken from the woods behind her house. On the back, another message. You were warned. The line between hunter and hunted had blurred completely now. What began as a shocking case with one twisted man had unraveled into a vast, unseen war. One where the rules were invisible, the players unknowable, and the cost of seeking truth could be fatal. And Maria was now knee-deep in it, with no idea who she could trust, or if she'd survive long enough to uncover what really happened to Gregory Harland. Or worse, what he might still be doing from the shadows. You said. Maria had always believed that fear was something you could train yourself to manage, something that ebbed and flowed with experience. As a detective, she had been through her share of crime scenes, chilling interrogations, and late-night stakeouts that would make the average person lose sleep for weeks. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared her for the moment she realized that someone was watching her. Not just once or twice, but constantly, deliberately, as if she were the one under investigation now. The unease began subtly. The sound of footsteps that didn't match her pace while she walked to her car after leaving the station. The flickering porch light that she could have sworn was fine the night before. Her neighbor, Mrs. Rios, casually mentioning that a tall man in a gray jacket had knocked on Maria's door mid-afternoon when she wasn't home, asking for her by full name, but refusing to leave a message. At first, Maria told herself it was coincidence, a symptom of the high-stress case she was working. But then things escalated, and there was no denying that something was closing in. It was a cold, rainy Thursday evening when everything changed. Maria's closest friend and former partner, Jonah Kent, had agreed to help her dig through the old records on Elijah Roone, despite his discomfort with reopening cases that had already been sealed. Jonah had been one of the few people she trusted completely. He was sharp, cautious, and didn't scare easily. But when he didn't show up for their scheduled meeting at her place, and didn't answer his phone all night, Maria's stomach turned to stone. The next morning, she drove to his apartment. His car was still in the driveway. No one answered when she knocked. She let herself in with the spare key he had given her years ago during a particularly dangerous case, a gesture of trust they'd never had to use until now. The place was spotless. Too spotless. Jonah wasn't a neat freak by any means, but there was no mail on the counter, no half-finished coffee on the table, no sign of recent life. His laptop was gone. So was the file folder he had taken home, the one with the copy of Claire's letter and the stills from the VHS tape. Maria's chest tightened. She called in a missing person report through unofficial channels. And how would they have cleared it so quickly unless they were already watching him, already expecting her to call? That night, she couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every car that slowed near her street sent her into high alert. She kept her gun within arm's reach. But when the power went out shortly after midnight, plunging her home into silent darkness, Maria didn't even flinch. She just stood there, gripping the weapon, knowing in her gut this was no accident. And that's when her phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. It was a message from Jonah's number. No, but the response she got from the officer on duty made her skin crawl. "We already cleared his apartment," the voice said flatly. No signs of struggle. He probably just needed space. It wasn't the words that unsettled her. It was the tone. Robotic. Rehearsed. Text. Just a video file. Shaky, blurry, barely visible at first. But as the frame focused, her breath caught in her throat. It showed Jonah sitting in a dark room, his hands tied, eyes swollen and frightened. "Maria," he whispered hoarsely, "don't trust anyone. Not in your department. Not even your own files. They've been rewritten. The program, Elijah's program, it's not just real, it's active. They're watching you now. They're inside your life." And then the video cut out. Maria stood frozen, heart pounding louder than the storm that had begun battering her windows. She ran to her files. The folder with Claire's original letter gone. Her second backup drive wiped. The printed report Jonah had left in her safe missing. Someone had been in her home recently, and they hadn't just wanted to scare her. They wanted to erase her trail. She was no longer a detective chasing shadows. She had become the target. And the terrifying part wasn't the fear. It was the realization that she had no idea who she could turn to, no idea how deep this network ran. Jonah was gone. Claire was missing, and the more Maria thought about it, the more she questioned every case she'd ever solved. How many people had been quietly removed, manipulated, rewritten by this invisible force hiding behind the face of Elijah Roone? She thought about the people she'd locked away, the ones she'd trusted, the promotions she'd received. What if every step of her career had been part of a design she never understood, each case carefully selected, each victory feeding the illusion of control while the truth remained just out of reach? Was this entire investigation into Gregory Harland a trap, one designed to lead her to Elijah, not so she could expose him, but so he could expose her? The line between reality and paranoia blurred completely now. The sound of silence had never felt so loud. And somewhere, in the dark, she knew someone was still watching, still waiting, still orchestrating the next move. Because as terrifying as the message from Jonah had been, it ended with one final phrase that now echoed in her mind on a loop. He doesn't just erase people, Maria, he rewrites their lives. And just like that, everything she thought she knew about her past, her work, and her identity was up for question. The truth was no longer a destination. It had become a moving target. And the more she chased it, the more it twisted into something far more dangerous than she ever imagined. Maria stared at the video Jonah had sent her, replaying it over and over, searching for anything, any detail she had missed in her initial panic. Each frame was burned into her memory now. Jonah's bruised face, his ragged breathing, the desperation in his voice. But something shifted the fifth time through. It was quick, barely noticeable. In the reflection of his eye, just a flicker, a blurry but unmistakable flash of red and blue light, the kind used in police interrogation rooms. Her heart dropped. Jonah wasn't being held in some underground lair or a secret hideout. He was in a police facility. And not just any facility. It looked like one of the old off-grid interrogation rooms in the department's retired annex building, a place no longer in use since the budget cuts years ago. At least, that's what they told everyone. The realization hit her like a freight train. The people doing this weren't outsiders. They were insiders, people who had access, authority, and clearance. People who knew the system well enough to bury the truth in plain sight. And suddenly, Maria understood why her files had disappeared, why every trace of Claire, Elijah, and even Jonah had been meticulously wiped or rewritten. The program Jonah mentioned wasn't just about surveillance. It wasn't about targeting random victims. It was something far more terrifying. It was about control, behavioral modification, psychological reprogramming. And if that technology had made it into the wrong hands within law enforcement, then it wasn't just one case she needed to solve. It was a cancer within the system itself. But before Maria could act on any of it, her phone rang. No ID, just a voice, calm, familiar, and completely unexpected. Maria, it's me. Claire. Maria nearly dropped the phone. Claire Thompson had been presumed dead for over 2 years, her case closed, her family long resigned to the mystery of her disappearance. And now she was calling as if none of that had happened. I don't have much time. They're listening. But I need you to stop chasing Elijah Roon. He was never the threat. I was. The words felt like an earthquake. You need to listen, Claire continued, her voice trembling but urgent. I created the program. It was mine. Elijah was just the face I used to hide behind. He agreed to be the fall guy because I promised him protection. But things spiraled. The department found out. They wanted to weaponize it, to rewrite suspects, manipulate memories, erase inconvenient truths. I tried to shut it down, but it was too late. They took it from me. They took everything. Maria stood motionless, her mind spinning. Claire was alive. Elijah was a scapegoat. The entire investigation, the VHS tape, the message scrawled in that haunting handwriting, it had all been carefully constructed misdirection. Claire had been the architect, and now she was running not just from the police, but from the very system she had helped create. Jonah figured out, Claire whispered. He was close to finding me. That's why they took him. And that's why they'll come for you next if you don't stop digging. Then silence. The line went dead. Maria leaned against the wall, trying to breathe, trying to steady herself against the weight of the revelation. Every instinct she had as a detective screamed for her to chase the lead, expose the truth, bring justice. But now, the very definition of justice was blurred beyond recognition. Claire hadn't disappeared. She had been hiding, not out of fear, but guilt. And Elijah Roon, the name etched into every report like a curse, wasn't a criminal. He was a pawn. Someone used and discarded by forces too powerful to confront directly. She thought back to all the missing persons cases, the closed files with too many unanswered questions, the surveillance footage that had conveniently glitched, the reports altered by technical errors. It had all been preparation,
Testing.
cover-up, and Maria had walked right into it. Now, with Jonah missing, Claire resurfacing, and her every move likely monitored, Maria had to make an impossible choice: follow the system's rules and become another erased statistic, or go rogue, vanish into the shadows like Claire had, and find the truth alone. And just when she thought she had time to decide, there was a knock at her door.
Slow.
Measured. Deliberate. Not from the front, but the back, where no one ever knocked. She moved cautiously, heart pounding. Through the curtain, she could make out a silhouette.
Tall.
Broad-shouldered. Holding something. A flash of light flickered through the window. A badge. But not from her department. Not one she recognized. And in that moment, Maria realized she wasn't just caught in a twisted web of deception. She was now the last loose thread in an operation desperate to stay buried. The knock came again. This time, louder. And all she could do was decide whether to open the door or disappear before they made the decision for her. Maria stood frozen at the rear entrance, the faint outline of the unknown figure still visible through the narrow curtain slit. Her hand trembled as it hovered near the doorknob, every part of her instinct screaming at her to run, but something deeper rooted her in place. She turned from the door, breath shallow, and slipped quietly into the hallway, phone clenched tight in her fist, its screen still blank. No signal. She knew then it was no coincidence. The knock wasn't just a warning, it was a message. She wasn't just under watch anymore. They were closing in. Whoever was behind this, they weren't leaving loose ends. Every minute she stayed put narrowed her options, yet every step she took toward escape risked tipping off whoever was watching. She had to make a move, but she also knew once she did, there would be no going back. Driving through the rain-soaked streets, Maria could still hear Claire's voice echoing in her mind. The confession, the guilt, the plea to stop chasing a lie, it all spun together in a storm of confusion and dread. She didn't want to believe it, but the pieces fit too well. Claire had created the technology. Elijah had been the shield. Jonah had discovered the truth. And now he was suffering because of it. But what gnawed at her most wasn't the conspiracy. It was the face of the man she was about to confront. Lieutenant Ryan Marks. Her mentor. Her former partner. The man who had guided her through her first years on the force and had always stood by her side like family. He had access to the department's deepest files, could sign off on field operations with no oversight, and had the authority to lock down evidence before anyone could question it. If anyone had helped bury this program, it was him. And if that were true, Maria would have to look him in the eye and ask a question she never thought she'd need to ask. Had he been protecting her, or using her? When she arrived outside Ryan's house, her heart sank at the familiarity of it all. The porch light still flickered from the loose wire he never bothered to fix, and his old truck sat idling in the driveway, the engine still warm. She knocked once, then again harder. No answer. But the door creaked open an inch, unlatched. Maria pushed through the silence into a house that felt too still, too staged. The TV was on but muted, the coffee still steaming on the table, and a manila folder left conspicuously open near the couch. Her name was written across the top. Maria opened it with hesitant fingers, and what she saw made her knees weaken. Surveillance photos of her, leaving her apartment, meeting with Jonah, entering the records archive. Each one time-stamped and labeled. Another section showed transcripts of her private calls, coded and analyzed. And beneath it all, a signature she recognized instantly. Ryan Marks. She turned to the sound of a creak behind her and found him standing in the hallway, his badge on his hip and a look on his face she couldn't read. Not guilt. Not shame. Something colder, resignation. "I tried to protect you, Maria," he said, voice low and steady. "You should have stopped when you had the chance." Her anger flared, but confusion held it back. "You were tracking me?
Why?
How long have you been part of this?" "I wasn't part of it," he replied, his tone sharp. "I built it. You think Claire acted alone? You think something like this gets greenlit without someone on the inside making the calls?" He stepped closer. "We created it for good. To eliminate threats before they happened. We were making sure no more kids got hurt, no more families destroyed by people the justice system kept letting go." "But people disappeared, Ryan. Innocent people. Jonah, he's being held in one of our own buildings. And that's why I let you get this far, Ryan said. Because I knew you'd find out, and I needed to see what you'd do with it. If you'd stay loyal, or if you'd burn the whole thing down. He reached into his coat pocket and handed her a small flash drive. That's everything. Every version of the program. Every file they tried to delete. You walk away now, this goes with you. You disappear, live a quiet life, and I make sure Jonah comes back in one piece. But if you keep digging, if you expose this, there's no undoing what follows. They'll come after you. And no one, not even me, will be able to stop them. Maria stared at the flash drive like it was radioactive. The choice felt impossible. Walk away and let the truth die, or risk everything, including Jonah, to bring it to light. And what haunted her more than the choice itself was the clarity in Ryan's voice, the way he said they, as if the force she was fighting against wasn't a group of people, but a machine that had grown too big to control. The ultimatum hung in the air, and Maria felt her throat tighten as she tried to steady her breath. Every instinct in her told her to run, to survive. But every memory of the people who had vanished, the victims erased, the lies stacked on top of more lies, told her she couldn't walk away from this. Not now. And then, before she could speak, the power in the house flickered. A shadow moved outside the window. Ryan turned toward the front door, his hand reaching for his weapon. They found us, he muttered. In that moment, Maria knew she no longer had time to choose. Whatever came next, she would be forced into it. The storm had finally arrived, and she was right in the middle of it. You said. The front door shattered open with a force that knocked the wind from the room, the blast echoing like a gunshot in the narrow hall. Maria dropped instinctively, her shoulders slamming into the coffee table as Ryan fired a shot toward the entrance. One, then two more, before dragging her by the arm and forcing her down the back hallway. There wasn't time to question who was coming. She knew now, knew they'd been listening this entire time, knew they were watching every move, and once Ryan handed her that flash drive, their tolerance ended. These people didn't give second chances. And they certainly didn't leave witnesses. They crashed through the back door and into the night, the storm no longer just a metaphor but a full-blown threat. Lightning ripped through the sky, thunder chasing it like a drumbeat of war. Ryan's truck was already gone, the engine still warm, a false hope that someone might be waiting to help. But there was no help coming. Not for them. Maria glanced at Ryan, still clutching his gun, eyes darting wildly. They had someone inside your department, he gasped as they ran. We both know it. But I didn't think. He stopped short. I didn't think it was her. Maria froze. Her who? He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed toward the dark outline of a car pulling into the alley, its headlights off, windows tinted. She recognized the license plate before the driver even stepped out. Captain Elise Monroe. The one person in the entire precinct who had always vouched for Maria, always offered quiet support when others questioned her obsession with unsanctioned leads or old cold cases. Elise had been like a mentor after Ryan was promoted and pulled into administrative duties. She'd even warned Maria to stop digging. Maria had chalked it up to concern. She was wrong. Elise stood calmly, dressed in plain black, her weapon already drawn but not pointed at them. You should have walked away, Maria, she said, her voice almost mournful. You had a way out. Maria's pulse pounded in her ears. You were part of it? This whole time? Elise tilted her head. I was never part of anything. I was cleaning up what others didn't have the stomach to finish. And I was trying to keep you alive in the process. Do you know how many people were taken out just for knowing about Project Echo? Do you think Jonah was the only one? Ryan tried to protect you in the beginning. I tried after he failed. But you just couldn't stop. Lightning illuminated her face for a split second, and what Maria saw wasn't hatred, it was sadness. Maybe even guilt. But guilt didn't matter anymore. Maria held up the flash drive. It's already been copied, she lied. Sent. If anything happens to me, this story goes public. For the first time, Elise looked uncertain. But only for a moment. Then we'll discredit it like we've done a dozen times before. You think the media hasn't had glimpses of this already? You think whistleblowers haven't tried to come forward? They either disappear or self-destruct. And the story gets buried under 10 layers of trending topics, TikTok drama, and AI fearmongering. No one cares until it's personal, Maria. And by then, it's too late. Ryan raised his weapon, his grip shaking. She's not giving you anything. Maria could see his internal war raging behind his eyes. He had started this mess, but she could tell he was willing to die trying to end it. Elise's eyes shifted toward him, and then, for the briefest moment, Maria saw it. Not hesitation. Not doubt. Something else. Her stance relaxed, just slightly. "Ryan," she said softly, "don't make me do this." He stepped in front of Maria. "You already did." The gunshot ripped through the storm, louder than the thunder this time. Maria screamed. Ryan stumbled, then collapsed to the ground in front of her, blood blooming across his chest. Elise stood still, her weapon lowered, her face hollow. Maria dropped to her knees, tears instantly spilling, and reached for Ryan. But he grabbed her wrist, smeared with blood, and forced the flash drive back into her palm. "Get it to Jonah," he whispered. "He'll know what to do." She couldn't breathe. She couldn't even scream. Elise took one step forward, but suddenly headlights flooded the alley from behind. Another car. Another figure stepping out. Maria turned, and her heart nearly stopped. It was Elijah.
Alive.
But barely recognizable. His face was gaunt, his hands trembling. "Stop," he shouted at Elise. "It's over." Elise stared at him like she'd seen a ghost. "You're supposed to be." This was bigger than her. Bigger than Jonah. Bigger than any single truth bomb. And now, with Elijah here, alive, hunted, and clearly holding knowledge no one else did, it was up to Maria to decide. Stay and fight, or run, regroup, and try to take them down from the outside. But before she could make that decision, another car pulled into the alley. Then another.
Lights.
Movement. Shadows approaching from all directions. And this time, they weren't here to talk. Maria gripped the flash drive, heart pounding, and looked at Elijah. "We're out of time," he said. And she knew everything from this moment forward would either expose the truth or bury them all for good. They moved through the underground tunnels with only the dim glow of a stolen flashlight guiding their way, boots echoing against damp cement, every sound amplified by the silence pressing in from all sides. Maria could feel her pulse in her throat, her hands slick with sweat and blood as she clutched the flash drive tighter than ever before. Elijah was a step ahead, limping, but driven by something deeper than pain, something raw, urgent, and buried in the years he had spent hidden, trapped in the web that had nearly consumed him. Somewhere behind them, the others, the agents Elise had once called allies, were closing in. But they weren't just trying to kill anymore. They were trying to erase everything. The people, the evidence, the truth. They emerged into a vast, darkened chamber beneath the city, an old Cold War command center long abandoned, at least officially. Rusted server racks and decaying hardware lined the walls, but in the center, a single terminal still hummed with low life, casting a faint blue glow. Elijah dropped to his knees in front of it and began typing furiously. "This is where it started," he said, his voice hollow. "They ran simulations here, trained the AI, built the list. It's all still stored on a local loop. They were too paranoid to use cloud servers. Too scared someone would intercept it. I can pull the access logs, the names, the original blackmail files. Everything." Maria didn't know what she expected to see when the files began appearing across the screen. Photos, names, surveillance reports, recordings, but it was worse than she ever imagined. Politicians, military officials, journalists, private citizens, people labeled as risk vectors for dissent, whistleblowing, or noncompliance. The entire program had evolved from predictive crime software into something far darker, a preemptive containment strategy. And it wasn't just theory. The logs showed a list of targets already neutralized, Jonah's name among them, his death staged as a random overdose. Dozens more followed. And Maria's name? Already flagged in red. Immediate threat. Escalation required. They didn't have time to react before the steel door at the far end of the chamber burst open, sending an echo through the room that felt like a death knell. Elise walked in, her weapon drawn, but she wasn't alone. Behind her stood Marcus Vell, the enigmatic tech magnate whose name had hovered at the edges of every conspiracy theory Maria had brushed against. He didn't look like a villain, no shadowy trench coat or sinister smirk. He looked bored, impatient, the way billionaires did when waiting for the world to bend to their will. "You really don't get it," Marcus said, stepping forward as Elise remained behind him, emotionless. "We didn't build this to control people. We built it because people are the variable. You think democracy is going to stop an AI that sees 10 steps ahead? You think freedom matters when the system predicts collapse unless someone takes control? We're not evil. We're necessary." Maria felt the words sink into her chest like ice. "You're killing people to stabilize the future?" Marcus shrugged. "Call it digital natural selection." Elijah lunged for the hard drive, but Elise fired a shot into the air, stopping him cold. "Don't," she warned. "I told you both to stop a long time ago." Maria stepped between them. "You used me," she said to Elise, voice trembling. "You watched my family fall apart, watched me drown in obsession, all while guiding me just close enough to the truth that I wouldn't see you standing in it." "I tried to protect you," Elise whispered, but even she didn't seem to believe it anymore. It was then that Elijah did something unexpected. He raised his hands and smiled. "You're wrong about one thing," he said to Marcus. "You said the cloud was too risky. But it wasn't. It was your arrogance that made you keep it here. And that's how I beat you." A deep hum filled the room. The server whirred louder. Maria turned to the monitor, where a file transfer bar had appeared, data uploading through a hidden backdoor Elijah had activated before Marcus and Elise even entered. "I cloned the entire system," Elijah said. "And I'm streaming it now."
Real time.
Live. Marcus surged forward, panic finally cracking his calm. "Shut it down." But it was too late. Maria could see the stream broadcasting across a secure link, thousands of nodes lighting up in response, journalists, activists, foreign watchdog groups. The truth wasn't just out, it was viral. Elise stared at the screen, then at Maria, then slowly lowered her weapon. "You just doomed everyone," she said, voice empty. "You think exposure saves people? Now they'll go to war to bury it." "No," Maria said, eyes locked on hers. "Now they have no place to hide." Marcus turned, as if preparing to lunge, but a sound behind him stopped everything. A low click. Ryan, bloody, barely alive, leaning against the entrance, holding a weapon in shaking hands. "Nobody walks out," he rasped. "Not unless she says so." Elijah moved first, grabbing the flash drive, tucking it into his pocket. Maria walked to Elise, weapon raised, but her hand trembling. She didn't want to kill. She wanted justice. But justice wasn't clean. And sometimes, justice bled. Suddenly, the monitors flickered. Every screen turned black. Then a new message appeared. Just one word. Override. Elijah froze. "That's not us." Marcus grinned. "Told you. We built it too well." In that moment, every light in the facility went out. Darkness swallowed them. A new layer of the mystery began unfolding in real time, suggesting that even Marcus hadn't been the top of the food chain. Someone else had been watching, manipulating, waiting for them all to converge. Maria stood in that silence, heart pounding, knowing this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far bigger than they had ever imagined. When the emergency crews finally reached the old command center buried beneath the city, all they found was smoke, shattered servers, and scorched walls where decades of secrets had been burned into oblivion. The media explosion had already begun. Raw footage leaked, files authenticated, government officials scrambling to issue denials even as their faces and names appeared on every screen across the nation. What started as whispers on fringe message boards erupted into a full-blown national scandal. Trending across YouTube, Reddit, and Twitter were hashtags like hashtag digital control, hashtag AI whistleblower, and hashtag shadow protocol exposed, and for the first time in years, people didn't just care, they were demanding change. But in the middle of the chaos, the people who had made the story possible were nowhere to be found. "I know," he said, limping forward. "They kept me alive for leverage. But I escaped. I saw what they were planning. And it's worse than any of you know." Maria stared at both of them. Elise stunned. Elijah, barely standing. Ryan, dying beside her. And suddenly, the truth clicked into place, not just about the people, but the entire system. This wasn't about one program or one rogue faction. It was an entire shadow network, hidden within agencies, protected by layers of fake investigations and cover stories, using real-time surveillance, AI prediction, and manipulation to erase threats before they became public. Maria disappeared without a trace. One moment she was giving a statement to a local news station under a pseudonym, and the next she was gone. Some said she fled the country, fearing retaliation. Others believed she had been silenced by the very forces she exposed. But those closest to her knew better. Maria had been searching for truth her entire life, not for fame, not for revenge, but for understanding. And after everything, she realized some answers came at too steep a cost. Her work lived on, encrypted on thousands of mirrored servers maintained by volunteers and activists, but Maria herself vanished into the noise, a ghost in the machine she helped destroy. To some, that made her a martyr. To others, a myth. But to those who truly listened, her story became a warning. Elijah's fate was stranger still. Weeks after the fire, a mysterious online post surfaced on a forum tied to cyberactivist communities. The account, verified as his by the cryptographic signature, claimed he had rebuilt parts of the system under new safeguards, turning the weaponized AI into a tool for transparency instead of oppression. It could predict corruption, flag manipulation in real time, and expose hidden patterns in government behavior. The system, now open source and distributed, couldn't be shut down by a single kill switch. Whether it was really Elijah or a copy of his code running autonomously, no one knew. But the implications shook the tech world. Tech influencers flooded YouTube with videos titled, "He Hacked the Government and Won. Elijah's algorithm is watching you now, and is AI the new whistleblower?" Sparking new waves of debates about privacy, ethics, and power. As for Elise, there were no sightings, no arrests, no funeral. Her name was scrubbed from agency records like she never existed, but traces of her past lingered in encrypted files and redacted documents. Some said she turned against the system and helped shut it down from the inside. Others claimed she was one of the few survivors of the final confrontation and was now operating under a new identity, deep within another covert agency. Rumors continued to circulate that Elise had been spotted in South America, or Eastern Europe, or even back in DC, hiding in plain sight. But what no one disputed was that she was the wild card, the inside player who walked the tightrope between loyalty and morality until the very end, and maybe beyond it. The final twist, though, came not from a leaked file or a secret transmission, but from a letter. A single page sent to a small independent journalist named Clara, whose YouTube expose had helped ignite the story in the first place. The letter contained no threats, no confessions. Just a question. Typed in plain, unformatted text. What if it's not over? Beneath it was a symbol burned into the letterhead, a circle split by a vertical line, the same one seen throughout the original data leaks, the same one etched onto the walls of the underground command center. Within hours of the letter going public, new activity began to stir in deep web forums. The AI system, dormant for weeks, appeared to have been reactivated by unknown users, though its output was now different, stranger. It began analyzing patterns not just in government behavior but in human behavior globally, predicting not crimes but movements, uprisings, collapses, revolutions. And that's how the story ended, or maybe began again. With a single idea echoing through every encrypted message, every conspiracy theory video, every late-night discussion, the truth doesn't die when you expose it. It evolves. Maria, Elijah, Elise, They weren't heroes in the traditional sense. They were people caught between impossible choices, facing off against an invisible enemy whose greatest power was convincing the world it didn't exist. Their journey revealed not just the scale of the conspiracy, but the terrifying ease with which power could justify erasing lives, rewriting facts, and twisting technology into a weapon of quiet control. For the millions who watched the story unfold, the final takeaway wasn't just about surveillance or corruption. It was about the cost of truth, about the price paid by those who dare to question the system. And as more people dug into the data, more strange anomalies began to surface. People long thought dead reappearing in records, deleted files returning without explanation, encrypted clues buried in code as if someone, or something, was still speaking from the shadows. To this day, YouTube videos revisiting the case still rack up views in the millions. Documentaries, podcasts, live breakdowns of the leaked footage, it became a digital rabbit hole that no one could stop falling into. And for those who had followed every detail, every twist, every disappearance, one question still haunts them long after the last frame fades to black. What if the real story hasn't even started yet?